This morning's reading is from Genesis. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There, in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age, and it had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old, and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child that I am old? Now that I am old? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "Oh yes, you did laugh."
Thank you, Cindy. I think maybe it's time to give Sarah a break. It's the very first time. It is the very first time that someone in the Bible laughs. Through the first 17 chapters of the very first book of the Bible, Genesis, we've seen just about everything. We see creating, we see resting, we see envy, we see violence, we see crime and punishment, we see paradise gained and lost. Through those first 17 chapters, we see just about everything. But no laughter. No laughter. Not a chuckle, not a chortle. No laughter. Until now. Until now. Before that laugh, God promises a couple of wandering, tent-dwelling nomads named Abram and Sarai that they are going to become the father and mother of the Israelite people. A people meant to be dedicated to God and God's ways and God's purposes. God promises Abram and Sarai that their descendants will be more numerous than the grains of sand on the earth and the stars in the sky. And then to seal the deal, God changes their names. Another first in the Bible. The first in what will be a series throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, especially where God changes people's names to signify that they have been called to some vital role or task on God's behalf. God changes Abram and Sarai's names to Abraham and Sarah. But about that countless descendants thing, by this time, not only have Abraham and Sarah not had countless descendants, the number of descendants they actually have together as a couple is a big fat 0. And things aren't looking good. Because, to put it delicately, I think, by this time, Abraham and Sarah are a bit up there. By this time, Abraham is over 100 years old, and Sarah is over 90 years old. The writer of Genesis specifically tells us, delicately, I think, that it had ceased to be for Sarah in the manner of women. To be fair, though, by this point in Abraham's life, I don't think it's a stretch to say, delicately, I think, that it was no longer in the manner of men for him. And given all that, I also don't think it's a stretch to say that under those circumstances, Abraham and Sarah must have been feeling a bit of, if not a deep sense, of disappointment and discouragement that God's promise had yet been fulfilled and seemed pretty unlikely. But as Abraham and Sarah are encamped at a place called Mamre, which in the ancient world was considered to be a sacred site, 3 men appear. 3 men appear as Abraham sits in the entrance of his and Sarah's tent. The entrance of a tent also, several times in the Hebrew scriptures, signifying that some sacred, important thing is going to take place. 3 men appear as Abraham sits in the entrance of the tent, and in keeping with ancient customs of hospitality, he hurries out to greet them. He addresses them as Lord, or in other translations, lords plural, because there are 3 of them, but it's lowercase Lord. Again, a term of respect in the ancient world. See, Abraham doesn't know that it's actually the Lord, capital L, and 2 members of the heavenly court who have come to see him and Sarah. The heavenly court, in ancient Jewish theology, the belief was that God was not alone at the beginning, that God was accompanied by other lesser divine beings, angels, messengers, that kind of thing, who were there to serve God's purposes. Abraham goes out to greet them, and then the hospitality continues. As he both prepares and as Sarah and one of their servants prepare and serve a full course meal. Now, the writer doesn't tell us much about the dinner conversation that ensues. Guessing it's probably the usual stuff: the weather, the Olympics, how it was the crime of the century that their preferred singer did not win that season's American Idol. The usual stuff. But then, one of the members of the heavenly court asks Abraham, "Hey, where's your wife?" Seems like an odd question. "Hey, where's your wife?" Abraham says, "In the tent." The angel/messenger isn't being creepy. He's asking because he wants to make sure that Sarah can hear him. Can hear him and hear what capital L Lord is about to say. Because capital L Lord is about to say to Abraham and Sarah out of sight, "You know, I think about a year from now, I'm going to come back to see you. I'll find you wherever you are, and I'm just going to stop by. Stop by so I can say hi to you and say hi to Sarah and say hi to your son, your first descendant." And Sarah hears, all right. Sarah hears and laughs. Sarah laughs to herself. And then she says, "Now that I've grown old, my husband's old, shall I have pleasure?" And that sounds exactly what you think it sounds like. In the Hebrew that Genesis is written in, that word we see, pleasure, refers to both sexuality and fertility. Sarah laughs to herself. Sounds about right, considering the seeming absurdity of what she has just heard. It seems about right, or at least not wrong. Except capital L Lord doesn't seem to agree. Capital L Lord doesn't seem to be happy that Sarah laughs. Asks Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh?" And now Sarah inside the tent is afraid. She's afraid that God is angry with her. Again, sounds about right, or at least not wrong. And so, in the face of that fear, she does the typical laugh. Who laughed? I didn't laugh. You laughed? Nobody laughed. I didn't laugh. You? It wasn't me. But of course, God knows that it is. The common interpretation is that Sarah should not have laughed, that her laughter was inappropriate, and that God wasn't happy about it. For most scholars, that is the common interpretation. For a number of scholars, they believe that that inappropriate laughter from Sarah was rooted in disbelief, the failure to still believe in God's promise, to trust that God's promise would still come true, a lack of faith, to put it differently. Other scholars see in Sarah's laughter a sense of sarcasm, as in, "Yeah, right, I'm going to have a kid in a year. And Abraham's going to start cooking and doing the dishes too." Still other scholars find Sarah's inappropriate laughter rooted in bitterness, ill will toward God, for God's promise to her not being fulfilled yet and not looking good. And still others see in Sarah's laughter a sense of dismissiveness, a kind of, "Yeah, whatever. Okay, enough of all this." But But maybe it's time to give Sarah a break. Because maybe Sarah's laughter wasn't rooted in any of that. Maybe it's time to consider that Sarah wasn't just laughing to herself, but at herself. And by that I mean that Sarah was exhibiting what's referred to as a sense of self-deprecating humor, which is understood to be the capacity to laugh at the seeming absurdities of ourselves, our circumstances, the groups, the teams, the sides, the parties that we belong to, all of that. The capacity to take issues seriously without taking ourselves too seriously. It is the type of humor and laughter that is considered to be the most emotionally and spiritually healthy. And it seems to me the kind of humor and laughter that we could use a bit more and probably a whole lot more of in this time. If we want to try to help in even the smallest way to, as we have been talking about for 4 weeks now, bring down the temperature in our nation and in our society. The journalist and author and editor Pamela Paul has recently suggested that we seem to be becoming a more and more humorless society. And she is far from alone in that opinion. For Paul and for many others, they see a society in which far too many of us individually and as members of particular groups see any joke, any intended sense of humor that is about us or the groups that we belong to as an attack, as a personal attack or a personal offense. But at the same time, as the longtime humor critic Jesse David Fox has pointed out quite a few times recently, we are also in a time where far too many are attempting to offer gratuitous types of jokes and humor for the express purpose of attacking or offending others, especially the most vulnerable in our society, whether it is related to their race, their ethnicity, their sexual orientation, their gender, their political or religious affiliation, whether it's related to ageism or any of the other kinds of isms. Gratuitous humor that is meant to intentionally offend, provoke. And the irony in all of that is it makes all of us more vulnerable. It makes us more vulnerable individually and as a society. Because as research has consistently demonstrated, that spiritually and emotionally healthy kind of laughter and humor, rooted in that self-deprecating sense of the absurdities of life and the world around us, that kind of humor has consistently been demonstrated to be beneficial to us, not just physically, but emotionally, socially, and spiritually. That the capacity for that kind of humor contributes greatly to things like social bonding and empathy. And those two things happen to be some of the primary building blocks of grace. Of grace. Grace, which in more general terms is defined as kindness and compassion, defined as goodwill toward others, even when we disagree or differ with them. But in Christian spiritual theology, grace is even more. In our spiritual tradition, grace is understood as kindness and compassion and goodwill, the kindness and compassion and goodwill that God offers us. Offers us. Even when we don't deserve it. And grace, rightly understood in Christian theology, says that we are incapable of deserving or earning that grace from God. Kindness, compassion, and goodwill toward others, even when we disagree or differ with them, even when we think they don't deserve it. Why? Because that's the grace that God offers us. And so given that, maybe it's time to not just give Sarah a break, but give God one too. Because if God is a God of grace, and I certainly believe that God is, then God cannot possibly be humorless. So perhaps God wasn't angry with Sarah. Perhaps then we should consider the possibility that God was not angry that Sarah laughed. That instead what God was looking for was for Sarah to acknowledge that laughter. To acknowledge the absurdities of her situation and everything that was going on that laughter was grounded in, the self-deprecating nature of it. Maybe what God was looking for was for Sarah to acknowledge it and not deny it, so that God could laugh with her too. Because God of all beings, surely recognized the absurdity of all of it, even though the promise was going to come true, had to have surely had the empathy to understand where Sarah was coming from. So I wonder if God wasn't just looking to laugh with Sarah, in the hopes that Sarah would not lose her sense of humor, the same way that God hopes and needs for us not to lose ours. Amen.